Hello everyone. Today we are going to look at two obstructions to moral thinking, moral relativism and egoism. Now, as you proceed or as you begin the journey in moral thinking, moral philosophy, there are two obstructions that you are bound to face, or many of us do face, and this is moral relativism and egoism. And let me briefly tell you what these two basically mean like. So, when you say that, well, to each his own, you are actually being a moral relativist, and this especially concerns moral philosophy and moral thinking because a very compelling argument that especially youngsters face, or most of us face, but especially it is compelling in the case of youngsters, is when we look at moral relativism claiming that, well, values are all relative and to each his own, so there is no way we can talk about values, or we can debate about values. So everyone has their own values, and therefore there's no point, or there's no scope for arriving at any value that can be argued for or discussed and debated. So if you have succumbed to, or you have encountered such tendencies, then that's what is a moral relativist, right? And if one is a moral relativist, then there is no possibility of moral knowledge. So something like moral knowledge, that is that even possible? Now, if let me erase this portion. Yes, okay. So is moral knowledge at all possible? To proceed on the journey of moral knowledge, right? And we are not talking about moral opinions or moral views, but moral knowledge. Knowledge meaning that is something that can be argued for, that is something that has a compelling rational force within it. So if one succumbs to the notion of moral relativism, one is probably not prepared to go ahead and discuss about moral notions or moral thinking, right? That's the first obstruction that we face when we on the journey to moral relativism, or first or the most dominant obstruction. And the second one is what philosophers called egoism, and which simply means that I do what I wish to do, and that is how things are, and that is how things ought to be. So there is no scope for discussion. So I do what I want to do, and that's a common pop phrase that we come across, that do what you want to do, listen to your heart, do what you wish for, or finally I do what I want to do. So if this is an approach that one holds, then one is also not on a journey of moral theorization, because in this sense we are all doing what we want to do or what we wish to do. The catchphrase here is, what does one want to do? Is that something which is coming out of nowhere, or is that a scope of deliberation? So there is this excellent chapter on ethics, and as you can see on the screen, it talks about the fundamental in the John Shand's book called Fundamentals of Philosophy. There is a chapter called Ethics, written by Pierce Ben. So this is a chapter from which these two arguments have been sourced, and of course I've added some of it from my own teachings in class. So this is a chapter that can help you visit and understand these two obstructions more carefully. So let's begin. Now, when we look at moral relativism, when we look at the world around us, we find values and practices and rituals and conventions, all of them are so different, right? What is known as cultural relativism. Say in one culture, we find that we are looking at certain practices as valid, and in another culture we are looking at other practices are valid, or rather the contrary to those practices as valid. So when we look at practices that are contrary and simultaneously followed in different parts of the world or in different cultures, we tend to think that, well, there is nothing intrinsically right or wrong about this practice, and each practice is relative to the part of the world or the part of the culture or family that we come across. Now, this variation in practices can be across cultures, across nations, across families, across communities, across even individuals, or even across various phases of an individual's lives. So, if moral relativism holds, if from cultural relativism we argue for moral relativism, then the whole possibility of moral philosophy ceases to be. So, whether this is the case or not, that is what we are going to examine. So, before that, now what I ask for is who is a moral fundamentalist? A moral fundamentalist is one who holds certain things as absolute and non-negotiable or universal. If that is the case, then because the moment we hear the name, the word fundamentalist, we tend to connect it with extremism or a terrorist or somebody who uses extreme forms of violence. But conceptually, that's not true. Anybody who uses or who holds to one value as supreme is a fundamentalist about that value. Now, a point to note here is that one can be a fundamentalist about one particular value. One doesn't have to be a fundamentalist, one doesn't have to be a fundamentalist about all the values what one holds, but about at least one value that is held as foundational or universal. So, if I say that Mahatma Gandhi was a fundamentalist, now that would might sound alarming right at the front, right at the start, but if you think through it, well, when he used non-violence as something which is foundational and fundamental, he can very well be regarded as a fundamentalist. So, what is now this is what a fundamentalist is. Having this background clear, let us try to frame out what is meant by moral relativism. Now, if you look at moral relativism, it is the doctrine that there is no one true moral system binding on all people at all times. Now, with such a definition, it seems very tempting, and the lure is that, well, there is, perhaps this is the way to look at it, and there is no one true moral system binding at all people at all time, and therefore there is no point talking about moral philosophy, and there is no point coming out to debate or look for something called moral knowledge. So, is a transcultural perspective possible in moral relativism? No. In moral relativism, a transcultural perspective is just not possible. But then, let us go ahead and look at moral relativism in a little bit more detail. What does moral relativism really lead us to? So, till this point, maybe the argument sounds in favor of moral relativism, because there is no single frame of reference that is true across cultures, right? But now let us think of it. If I say that, well, if there is a dispute between two people, let them fight it out and settle it. If I say that aggression or physical violence is a value of the perpetrator, and there is no way we can check them morally, that physical violence is fine with them, so it is a acceptable value. Now, let me pull up something which is more significant, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in there is one claim that says, and of course all of them are universal declarations, and that is a biggest testimony in the search for a universal human value, that one of the declarations is that no one can be punished or can be given a verdict without the chance to present their point of view. That means the very notion of the system of judiciary, where one has a chance to defend oneself. The classical case of say Ajmal Kasab undergoing a trial. Now, for some of us it may have been a wastage of time and resources and quite impatient, but to look at it as a value that the Indian constitution holds, that no one can be punished without a trial, or no one can be judged upon without a trial, where that person gets the ability to represent his or her own self. So, moral relativism, now it starts to seem difficulty here, and what we are going to establish over here or trying to establish in this argument is that what the lure of moral relativism is actually not what is meant by moral relativism, but it is intellectual humility and moral toleration. That seems to be what we really value, or what significantly people value, but term it rather inaccurately as moral relativism. So, let us see what is intellectual humility. Now, not being dogmatic or being open to revision, or the impossibility of knowledge. So, what does the meaning of intellectual, or what is, when we unpack the phrase intellectual humility, we mean, well, if one looks at the lure of moral relativism, we are saying that, well, the temptation of moral relativism is that we really do not know what is the right thing to do, and therefore we are intellectually humble and we are not making a judgment, right? But is that what relativists do? Relativists say that there is no judgment possible rather than there being a scope of error. So, when we unpack this word called intellectual humility, we see that it really does not mean moral relativism. So, intellectual humility is not equal to moral relativism. So, intellectual humility is not equal to moral relativism, whereas we tend to think that intellectual humility is the same thing as moral relativism. So, to be intellectually humble is not to be dogmatic, it is to be open to revision. Or does it mean impossibility of knowledge? No. If you call yourself intellectually humble, then you do not deny knowledge, but what you say, that the knowledge that I have may be revised, right? Now, the other crucial phrase that we come across, which is disguised as moral relativism, is moral toleration. Now, what is moral toleration? Moral toleration, we all would like to, or many of us would like to be known as tolerant. So, does it reject judgmentalism, factoring our own non-rational intake, or does it mean something else? And there is a lovely example that the text offers, that listen to say a racial banter of your cab driver. You are not responding to the cab driver, but you are nevertheless making a judgment of disagreement with that. So, we are making judgment. So, what is toleration? An analysis of the concept of moral toleration has to be understood. Does someone who tolerates a value that one does not approve of, is one being a relativist about it, or is one being making a judgment about it but not expressing it? Let us say when the threshold is, this particularly comes into the case when the threshold is low. So, if you find somebody with a practice, and here I will make a distinction between moral practice and moral values in a moment, but when you come across moral practices, you would take a look that, well, certain things that you do not approve of. Let us think of say somebody who is let's think of a mildly low threshold moral practice. Let us say stick to casteist claims. I think something that we can connect to much more in the Indian milieu rather than or regional claims, that when you find somebody in conversation is making casteist claims, well, you may not approve of it, but you do not make a protest unless until it crosses a threshold. So, you are being tolerant of others' views, but to the point that you are, it is not that you are indifferent to the proposal at hand, but you are finding the threshold not high enough to react to. So, the point is that the one who is practicing tolerance is making a judgment, is making an absolute claim, but is not expressing it. How would it be if you are a relativist? A genuine moral relativist would look at any practice without judging it at all. because a genuine moral relativist would look at a person squashing a puppy or a group of kids trying to play football with a live puppy as curious, unjudging way of looking at things, whereas for the tolerant this may be the threshold crossed, and they would immediately intervene as to why this should not be done. So agreed that there are a lot of moral differences, but that we live in the same world is also a testament that we have to arrive at some agreed upon values. Now let me give you one more example that perhaps seals the deal totally. If you look at the law books of the world, constitutions, laws, judiciary, how are laws made, right? That why is killing a fellow human being punishable? Now that is something, as a relativist you cannot make that claim. You would like to, a genuine relativist would say that, well, that is right from that person's perspective, murder is right from your perspective, and it's not right from my perspective. So what right do I have to impose your my views on yours? So if that is how a genuine moral relativist would be. So in a moral relativist framework there can be no laws that, well, cheating is right or cheating is wrong, that, well, somebody could say that, no, this is my way of looking at the world, that I can lie, cheat for my own gain, these are my values and they are different from your values. So the whole possibility edifice of the laws stands on the assumption of moral universalism, that there are some values that are universal. There are differences in a lot of values, but there are some values that are universal. So the whole fact, the very fact that we have laws is a proof that moral universalism holds. These laws are revisable. These laws are not laws that are eternal, that always stand with what are not eternal or absolute across times and places. These are open to revision. So that laws can be open to revision depending on societal consensus is again a value that has been universalized. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a value that has been universalized. So when we look at moral relativism, however tempting the hat of moral relativism is, one should know very carefully what it implies and what it means before one commits oneself to a moral universalistic position. So to a moral relativistic position. So a moral relativist will be the one who is unable to make any judgments on what one comes across. So it's a strange way of looking at the world, that which most of us do not look at. So let me stick my neck out and say that when we or in popular culture, when we claim that we are not being judgmental, right? Are we really not being judgmental, or are we being tolerant? Of course, there are some practices in which one can be non-judgmental, but in many practices, or in a few practices at least, one is making a judgment but not expressing it, and that is not moral relativism, that is moral tolerance, right? What we have been understanding as intellectual humility, or what we have been understanding as moral relativism, and the lure of moral relativism is because of the lure of intellectual humility and moral toleration. But intellectual humility and moral tolerations, these are not moral relativism. So analogically put, well, you tend to say fall in love with someone, and because you think they have these qualities, but when you find out that, well, you have fallen in love with these qualities, but these qualities are really not there in that person, so then you realize that here this love affair is a failed love affair, right? So in a jocular vein, of course, that is to emphasize that what the lure of moral relativism is intellectual humility and moral toleration, but both of these do not entail moral relativism. Now summing it up in a form that we can understand, that when I talk about, is moral relativism a claim about the process of moral reasoning or a claim about the conclusions of moral reasoning? The answer is former, because moral relativism is a claim about the conclusions of moral reasoning. And what is the conclusion? That there can be no conclusion. So, one needs to distinguish between I may be wrong vis-a-vis there is no right answer, and that is where the notion of fallibilism comes into existence. The fallibilist accepts the uncertainty of her frame of reference, but does not accept that all frames of reference are morally equal. So, when somebody claims to be a moral relativist, is probably being a fallibilist, where one is open to revision, one is unsure of one's position. But to be a moral relativist, you have to hold the view that there can be no right answer, that there can be no right conclusion. So, this is what a moral relativist hold. Now, all cultures, are they morally equal? Because when you look at cultures being morally equal, for a moral relativist, all cultures will be morally equal, right? And for a moral absolutist or a moral fundamentalist, that will not be morally equal. So, when we look at, say, cultures, if you go through the text, it will talk about female genital mutilation. Now, would you hold those cultures at par with or morally equal with other cultures that do not follow it? So, once we look at we are making judgments, we can converse. So, we have to we arrive at laws is when we look at where can we have consensus. So, to be a moral fundamentalist or to be a moral relativist is to discard the possibility of laws. The moral fallibilist says there is a best way to live, but I may be mistaken as to what it is. The relativist says there is no best way to live because the very idea is inherent culturally relative. This is a crucial takeaway quoted from the text itself, that when we look at the conclusion, for the fallibilist, the conclusion has still not been reached, the journey is on, but for the relativist, the journey is without a destination. Yes, I think that will be an appropriate way of putting it. For the fallibilist, the journey is on with the belief that there is a destination. For the relativist, there is no destination, because that idea is itself inherently culturally relative. In passing reference, before we end our discussion on moral relativism, I will talk about self-reflexivity, which is the bane of any relativist commitment. This is of course a logical fallacy with relativism, which is of a simple format, that any self-reflexive system will contradict itself, in the sense that, well, if the relativist says that all values are relative, then this claim itself, that all values are relative, is this itself the claim in this box itself, is it relative or is it absolute? Now, that is a tricky little logical problem that all self-reflexive systems face, because they have to have one axiom as absolute. So, for the relativist, if they counter argue, they would say that this particular axiom is the truth and has to be held true, and the rest can all be held as relative. So, to sum up our discussion on moral relativism, we talk about, well, the lure of moral relativism is actually the lure of fallibilism, and to be a fallibilist is not to be a moral relativist. To be open to revision is not to deny that there is a right answer possible. So, as put up in the earlier slide, to be open to the possibility that I am wrong is one position, but to believe that there is no right answer is another position, and the moral relativist sticks to this other position. Okay. Now, we come to this catch-all theory called egoism. Now, egoism is a catch-all theory because it holds that all actions are motivated only by desire, right? And that seems fairly reasonable, that, well, all actions are motivated only by desire. But isn't there a distinction between self-interested desire and other interested desire, right? Now, if I act in only what gives me satisfaction or happiness, but then what is it to act otherwise? Or are these random acts? I do what I wish to do. So, to be an unegoist, do I have to act contrary to my wishes? Let's play it out. What is this talking about? So, the egoist talks about all actions are motivated only by desire. That means I do what I wish to do. But what I wish to do is something that does not happen automatically, right? So, a classical question asked is, why do you give to a beggar? Assuming that you give alms to a beggar. Now, one way could be that I just feel good, that is why I give to a beggar. So, anybody who feels good about something gives something to a beggar. But then, what is it that makes me feel good about it? And here is where the folly of egoism comes into play, that egoists mention that whatever I do it only for which gives me satisfaction, but what gives me satisfaction is quite a broad area, right? Other interested activities, so I can see the happiness in helping the needy, can give me happiness. By looking after or aggressively pursuing my own hedonistic pleasures can also give me happiness. So, the difficulty that the egoist as an catch-all theory faces is that looking at happiness as something which is very narrow, because also looking at what one wishes as something very narrow. When we look at what I wish for, that wishing itself is a contemplative deliberative process. It is not a process that just happens autonomically. There is a school of philosophers called emotivists, in fact not a school but a strain, which talks about that, well, whatever feels good I do it and that is right, and whatever I don't feel good about I don't do it or I find it wrong, and that is. So, emotions as the and primitive reactive emotions, not deliberated thought through emotions. We will continue the discussion of egoism in the next session. Thank you.